In the glittering salons of 1880s London, where reputations were forged and destroyed over teacups, Lady Lydia Ashford possessed a power few women ever knew. Knowledge that could topple ministers and shatter dynasties. She had witnessed corruption in the highest chambers, heard confessions from men who believed her too delicate to understand politics, collected secrets like others collected calling cards. Yet when her father's gambling debts demanded payment, she found herself bound, not by love, but by parchment and seal, a marriage contract that transformed her from society's most perceptive observer into its most silent prisoner. For in the ornate script of that document lay a clause so devastating, so cunningly crafted, that speaking a single political truth would cost her everything she held dear. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashford House in Mayfair, casting elongated shadows across the Persian carpets that had adorned the entrance hall for 3 generations. Lady Lydia Ashford stood before her dressing mirror, her lady's maid adjusting the emerald silk gown that perfectly complemented her auburn hair and intelligent green eyes. At 22, Lydia possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads at every soiree, but it was her mind that truly set her apart in a society that preferred its women ornamental rather than observant. "You look radiant, my lady," Mary murmured, securing the final pearl pin in Lydia's elaborate coiffure. "Lord Blackwood won't be able to take his eyes off you at tonight's engagement celebration." Lydia's reflection offered a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Lord Garrett Blackwood, the man she was to marry in precisely 3 weeks. The union had been arranged by her father, the Earl of Ashford, whose fondness for the card tables at White's had transformed a once substantial fortune into a precarious house of cards. The Blackwood family, wealthy beyond measure from their shipping empire and political connections, required aristocratic lineage to cement their social position. Her father required their money to stave off ruin. It was, as everyone assured her, a perfect match. "Has my father returned from his morning ride?" Lydia asked, though she suspected the answer. The Earl's morning rides lately concluded at his club, where brandy flowed more freely than conversation. "Not yet, my lady, but Lady Ashford requests your presence in the drawing-room." Lydia descended the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the mahogany banister worn smooth by generations of Ashfords. The house itself was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture, purchased in more prosperous times, now maintained through strategic economies that her mother orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Every servant retained, every dinner party hosted, every appearance of normalcy was a carefully constructed illusion. Her mother, Lady Catherine Ashford, sat ramrod straight in the drawing-room, her silver hair impeccably arranged despite the early hour. Before her lay correspondence, calling cards, and a leather-bound ledger that Lydia recognized as the household accounts. "Ah, Lydia, come sit. We must discuss tonight's arrangements." Her mother's voice carried the aristocratic inflection of someone who had never questioned their place in society's hierarchy until circumstance forced the reckoning. "The Blackwoods are hosting the engagement ball at their residence in Belgrave Square. It will be the event of the season, 200 guests, including half of Parliament." Lydia settled onto the settee, arranging her skirts with practiced grace. "I understand Lord Blackwood's father wishes to make a political statement with the celebration." "Precisely. Viscount Blackwood has ambitions for his son, a seat in Commons, perhaps even a ministerial position eventually. Your family name lends them the aristocratic credibility they've always lacked, despite their wealth." Lady Catherine's pale blue eyes studied her daughter with an expression that mingled maternal affection with pragmatic assessment. "And their fortune secures our family's future. It is, my dear, the way of our world. But what of love? The question remained unspoken, as it had throughout the 3 months since the betrothal was announced. Lydia had harbored girlish dreams once, of a marriage built on mutual respect and affection, of conversations that extended beyond weather and social niceties, of a partner who valued her observations about the political machinations she witnessed at every dinner party she attended. Since her debut 3 years prior, Lydia had developed an unusual reputation among London's elite. While other young ladies discussed fashion and gossip, she had cultivated the ability to listen, truly listen, to the conversations swirling around drawing rooms and smoking rooms alike. Men, she discovered, often spoke freely in the presence of women they assumed too simple to comprehend matters of state and commerce. She had learned to ask precisely calibrated questions that encouraged confidences, to remember every detail, to perceive the connections between seemingly unrelated events. She knew, for instance, that Lord Pemberton had accepted bribes to influence railway contracts, that Sir Charles Whitmore had embezzled funds from his own charitable foundation, that 3 members of Parliament were entangled in a scheme to manipulate grain prices during the recent shortage. This knowledge gave her a peculiar kind of power, one she had never fully exploited, but one that made her an invaluable confidant to those who recognized her discretion. Lord Garrett Blackwood had courted her with the efficiency of a business transaction. He was handsome in a sharp, angular way, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes the color of slate. His manners were impeccable, his conversation intelligent if somewhat rehearsed, his attention to her correct without being particularly warm. He treated her as one might treat a valuable acquisition, with care, but without passion. "I've prepared your jewellery for tonight," Lady Catherine continued, retrieving a velvet case. "The Ashford emeralds. They were your grandmother's." Lydia accepted the case, opening it to reveal the magnificent parure, necklace, earrings and bracelet, each piece featuring deep green emeralds surrounded by diamonds. The set represented not just beauty, but legacy, one of the few family treasures her father hadn't yet been forced to sell. "Wear them proudly tonight," her mother said softly, reaching across to clasp Lydia's hand. "I know this isn't the romantic match you might have dreamed of in your schoolroom days. But Garrett Blackwood is a respectable man from a powerful family. You will want for nothing materially. That is more than most women can claim." The unspoken addition hung in the air, "and far more than we can provide if you refuse." The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of preparations. Lydia's younger sister, Arabella, only 17 and still mercifully unburdened by the necessity of a strategic marriage, flitted about excitedly, trying on gloves and debating which fan to carry. Their brother Thomas sent word that he would meet them at the Blackwood residence, having spent the afternoon at his club, following too faithfully in their father's footsteps, Lydia feared. As evening approached, and Lydia dressed for the ball, Mary securing the emeralds at her throat, she studied her reflection and practiced the expression she would wear throughout the night. Serene, gracious, appropriately excited about her impending nuptials. It was a performance she had perfected, this ability to present exactly what society expected while her true thoughts remained locked away. The Blackwood mansion in Belgrave Square blazed with light when their carriage arrived. Footmen in elaborate livery lined the entrance, and the sounds of a full orchestra drifted from the ballroom. Viscount Blackwood and his wife stood in the receiving line, their pleasure at the advantageous match barely concealed beneath aristocratic reserve. Lord Garrett Blackwood stood beside them, resplendent in formal evening attire, his expression as he watched Lydia approach revealing satisfaction rather than adoration. "Lady Lydia," he greeted her, bringing her gloved hand to his lips in a gesture that was technically romantic but felt oddly transactional. "You look exquisite. The emeralds suit you." "Thank you, Lord Blackwood. Your family's hospitality is magnificent. Only the best for my future bride." He offered his arm. "Shall we greet our guests? Half of Parliament is indeed here as Mother promised. Father wishes me to make strategic connections tonight." And there it was. The true purpose of their union laid bare. As Garrett guided her through the crowd, introducing her to politicians and industrialists, Lydia performed her role flawlessly. She smiled, conversed appropriately, accepted congratulations with gracious humility. All the while, her keen mind catalogued every interaction, every subtle exchange, every barely perceptible tension between rivals forced into social proximity. She noticed when Lord Pemberton avoided eye contact with Sir Edmund Cross. The latter had likely discovered the railway bribery scheme. She observed Lady Thornton's icy demeanour toward Mrs. Hartwell, a rivalry over some social slight, or perhaps something more personal. She perceived the way several younger MPs deferred to an older gentleman whose name she didn't know, but whose influence was evident in their body language. "You're quiet tonight," Garrett observed during a brief moment when they stood apart from the crowd. "I hope the attention isn't overwhelming." "Not at all. I'm simply observing. It's a fascinating gathering." "Indeed, Father has spared no expense. This celebration cements our family's position in society. And your presence," he gestured vaguely at her, as if she were an ornamental piece, "adds the aristocratic pedigree we've always lacked." The words, though true, stung with their bluntness. But Lydia maintained her serene expression. "I'm honored to join your family, Lord Blackwood." As midnight approached and the celebration reached its crescendo, Lydia found herself alone for a moment on a balcony overlooking the garden. The cool night air provided relief from the stifling ballroom. She gripped the stone balustrade, allowing herself one moment of unguarded honesty, of acknowledging the cage that was closing around her, however gilded its bars might be. "Lady Lydia?" She turned to find a stranger approaching, a man perhaps in his early 30s, with kind eyes and an intelligent expression. He wore formal attire, but with a slightly rumpled quality that suggested he valued comfort over pristine presentation. "Forgive the intrusion. I'm Dr. Graham Thornhill. I was invited by Lord Pemberton. We've been collaborating on public health legislation." He paused, studying her with unexpected perception. "You looked as though you needed a moment away from the spectacle." The engagement ball continued in full splendor as Lydia returned from the balcony, Dr. Thornhill's kind words still echoing in her mind. He had been the first person all evening to ask how she felt about the upcoming marriage, rather than offering congratulations on the advantageous match. His genuine interest had been both refreshing and unsettling, a reminder of what her union with Garrett Blackwood lacked. The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Wedding breakfasts were planned, trousseau items were ordered, the guest list expanded to include every person of consequence in London society. Lydia dutifully attended fittings for her wedding gown, a confection of ivory silk and Belgian lace that cost more than most families earned in a year. She smiled through congratulatory visits, nodded appropriately during discussions of her future household, and never once voiced the growing unease that settled in her chest like a stone. 2 days before the wedding, Garrett requested a private meeting in the Ashford House library. Lydia found him standing before the window, his posture tense in a way she'd never observed during their courtship. "My father has drawn up the marriage contracts," he began without preamble, producing a sheaf of legal documents. "They require your signature, as well as your father's." Lydia accepted the papers, her eyes scanning the dense legal language. Most of it was standard: property arrangements, financial settlements, the usual provisions. But as she read deeper, her breath caught. "The party of the second part, hereinafter the wife, agrees to absolute discretion in all matters pertaining to commercial, political and personal affairs of the party of the first part and his family. Should the wife disclose any information deemed sensitive by the party of the first part, she shall forfeit all rights to property, settlement, and shall be held legally liable for damages as determined by the party of the first part, including but not limited to complete seizure of her family's remaining assets and properties." "What is this clause?" Lydia's voice remained steady despite her alarm. "This essentially prevents me from speaking about anything you deem sensitive, which could be interpreted as anything at all." Garrett's expression hardened. My father insisted upon it. The Blackwood family has certain business interests that require protection. We cannot risk having family confidences exposed, but this goes far beyond protecting business secrets. This could prevent me from speaking truth about anything: corruption, illegal activities, moral transgressions. Lydia's mind raced through implications. If I discovered wrongdoing and reported it, you could claim it violated this clause and seize my family's property, leave them destitute. Only if you chose to betray family confidences, Garrett replied coolly. A loyal wife would have nothing to fear. Lydia set down the contracts, her hands trembling slightly. And if I refuse to sign, then there will be no wedding. The engagement will be dissolved, your family's debts will be called in immediately, and Ashford House will be sold within the month. His slate-grey eyes held no warmth, only calculation. Your father has already signed, Lady Lydia. He understood the necessity. The trap snapped shut with perfect precision. Her father, desperate and drowning in debt, had sold not just her hand in marriage, but her very voice. Everything she had observed, every piece of knowledge about political corruption she had carefully collected, it would all be rendered useless, weaponized against her own family, should she dare speak. I need time to consider. There is no time. The wedding is in 2 days. Sign or inform the 300 guests that you're cancelling. Garrett's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. I assure you, Lady Lydia, this marriage will proceed whether you fully comprehend your obligations or not. That night, in the privacy of her chamber, Lydia wept for the first time since her betrothal. Mary found her at dawn, still dressed in her evening gown, the unsigned contract spread before her. My lady, what's wrong? Lydia couldn't answer. How could she explain that she was being asked to sign away not just her future, but her integrity? That the man she was meant to marry saw her intelligence not as an asset, but as a threat requiring legal constraint. The wedding day arrived with cruel beauty. Brilliant sunshine, illuminating St. George's Church in Hanover Square, where London's elite had gathered in their finest attire. Lydia moved through the morning preparations as if in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. She had signed the contracts the previous evening, her signature a surrender she despised but could not avoid. The church bells rang as her father escorted her down the aisle, his hand trembling against her arm, whether from drink or guilt she couldn't determine. The Earl had aged a decade in the past months, the weight of his failures etched in every line of his face. Garrett waited at the altar, impeccable and handsome, his expression revealing nothing of the calculated manipulation that had brought them to this moment. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself officiated, lending even greater prestige to the union. Lydia's responses were mechanical as she repeated the vows, her voice steady despite the tumult in her heart. The ceremony concluded without incident. They signed the register, accepted congratulations, proceeded to the wedding breakfast at Blackwood House, where 200 guests celebrated with champagne and elaborate courses. Lydia performed her role flawlessly, the radiant bride, the perfect aristocratic addition to the Blackwood dynasty. It was during the toasts that everything shattered. Viscount Blackwood rose, glass in hand, his voice carrying across the assembled guests. To my son and his beautiful bride, Lady Lydia brings to our family not just noble lineage, but I'm told a remarkable intellect and powers of observation. He paused, and Lydia felt a chill of premonition. She's become quite known for collecting information about London's society. But now, of course, her loyalties lie solely with the Blackwood family. She understands the value of discretion. A polite laughter rippled through the crowd, but Lydia heard the warning embedded in her father-in-law's words. He was publicly announcing her muzzling, ensuring every person present understood that whatever she might know, she was now bound to silence. Then Lord Pemberton, emboldened by champagne and perhaps by malice, stood. Indeed, Lady Lydia, or should I say Mrs. Blackwood now, has been the most perceptive observer in every drawing-room. Why, I recall her making quite pointed inquiries about railway contracts last season. I trust such curiosity will now be properly directed. The comment landed like a stone in still water, ripples of realization spreading through the gathered politicians and society members. Several faces turned toward Lydia with expressions ranging from amusement to concern. She felt exposed, her careful cultivation of knowledge transformed into entertainment for men who feared what she might know about their own misdeeds. Garrett's hand tightened painfully on her arm. "Smile," he commanded through gritted teeth, but worse was yet to come. Lady Charlotte Whitmore, daughter of Sir Charles, the embezzler Lydia had identified months ago, rose with a glass and a malicious smile. A toast to the bride. How fortunate that her remarkable memory and intelligence will now be devoted entirely to her husband's interests. After all, a woman of such perception could cause considerable trouble if her observations were ever made public. But marriage has a way of tempering such dangerous inclinations, doesn't it? The laughter that followed was sharper, crueler. Lydia felt the blood drain from her face as understanding crystallized among the guests. They knew, or suspected, that she possessed damaging information about many of them, and they were celebrating her enforced silence. "Charlotte speaks truth," added another voice. Lord Edmund Thorne, a member of Parliament whose financial irregularities Lydia had documented in her private journals. Women should concern themselves with household management, not matters beyond their comprehension. Marriage will surely cure Lady Lydia of her unnatural interest in political affairs. Each comment struck like a lash. What she had believed was respect for her intellect had been instead barely concealed fear and contempt. They had tolerated her observations only because she was unmarried, inconsequential, easily dismissed. Now bound by marriage and that devastating contract, they celebrated her neutering with barely disguised relief. Garrett rose, raising his glass. "Gentlemen, ladies, I thank you for your candid observations. I assure you, my wife understands her duties. Her days of inappropriate curiosity are behind her. She will devote herself to supporting my political ambitions and maintaining our household with proper feminine discretion." The applause that followed felt like the closing of a tomb. Lydia sat frozen, her face maintaining its gracious expression through sheer force of will, even as humiliation burned through her veins. Around her, the celebration continued. Guests drinking, laughing, discussing her transformation from threat to trophy with open satisfaction. Her mother caught her eye across the room, Lady Catherine's expression revealing helpless sympathy mixed with resignation. This was the price of their family's survival, not just Lydia's marriage, but her complete subjugation. When the breakfast finally concluded, Garrett escorted her to a private sitting room under the pretense of a moment's rest before the departure for their honeymoon in the Lake District. The moment the door closed, his cordial mask evaporated. "That performance was humiliating," he hissed. "You sat there like a statue while they mocked you. What did you expect?" Lydia's composure finally cracked. "You've turned me into a public spectacle. They're celebrating the silencing of a woman who dared to think. Your father practically announced that I'm now your property, legally bound to secrecy. You are bound to secrecy. That contract protects my family's interests." Garrett's face flushed with anger. "I won't have my wife embarrassing me with her unnatural fascination with political intrigue. You will learn your place, Lydia. You will smile, you will host dinners, you will support my career, and you will forget whatever you think you know about anyone. Or what? You'll destroy my family. We both know that threat is the only reason I'm here. Then remember it well." He straightened his cravat, his expression cooling to calculated contempt. "I had hoped you would be sensible, but if you require reminders of your obligations, I'm prepared to provide them. My father has already drafted letters to your father's creditors. One word from me, and Ashford House is seized. Your mother and sister will be penniless. Your brother's commission in the Guards will be revoked. Is that clear enough?" Lydia looked at the man she had just married, truly looked at him, and saw not a partner, but a jailer. The handsome features seemed to warp into something cruel and cold. How had she missed this? Or had she seen it and simply convinced herself it was the pragmatism required of ambitious men? Perfectly clear, Lord Blackwood. Garrett, he corrected with false warmth. We're married now, my dear. Do try to remember the appropriate intimacy. The remainder of the day passed in a haze. They departed for Waterloo Station amid a shower of rose petals and well-wishes, boarding a private railway carriage that would carry them north. Lydia sat by the window, watching London disappear behind her, feeling as though she were leaving behind not just her family, but her very self. The Lake District should have been beautiful. Windermere's waters, reflecting autumn colours, the surrounding fells dramatic against grey skies. But Lydia saw it through a veil of despair. Garrett maintained his public persona in the charming cottage he'd rented, playing the attentive bridegroom when servants were present. In private, he was distant, spending his time reading newspapers and drafting correspondence for his political ambitions. On the third night of their honeymoon, Lydia made one final attempt to reach the man she had thought she was marrying. Garrett, please, can we not find some compromise? I don't wish to interfere with your career. I only ask that you not require my complete silence if I witness genuine wrongdoing. Enough. He set down his brandy with a sharp click. This discussion is closed. You signed the contract. You spoke the vows. You are mine now, Lydia. My wife, my property, in all but the most technical legal sense. Whatever intelligence you possess, whatever observations you've made, they belong to me. Your voice belongs to me. Accept it, or the consequences will be severe. That night, lying in the darkness of their rented cottage, Lydia understood with terrible clarity that her marriage was not merely loveless. It was a prison constructed of legal documents and financial threats. She had been purchased, silenced, and displayed as proof of the Blackwood family's arrival into the highest echelons of society. The girl who had once dreamed of partnership, of mutual respect, of using her considerable intellect for something meaningful, that girl had died somewhere between the altar and this cold bed. When they returned to London 2 weeks later, taking up residence in the elegant townhouse Garrett had purchased in Belgravia, Lydia began the performance that would define her existence. She became the perfect political wife, hosting dinners where she smiled and said nothing consequential, attending parliamentary functions where she listened to discussions of corruption and remained silent, accepting social calls where she discussed only the most trivial matters. Her private journals, where she had once documented everything she observed, remained locked away and abandoned. What was the point of recording truth she could never speak? But late at night, when Garrett was away at his club or engaged in political meetings, Lydia would stand at her window overlooking the gaslit street and feel the weight of her silence crushing her. She possessed knowledge that could reform Parliament, expose criminals, protect the vulnerable, and she could use none of it without destroying everyone she loved. The cage was complete, and it was gilded with emeralds and silk, locked with legal contracts and financial threats, guarded by a husband who valued her beauty but despised her mind. 3 months into her marriage, Lydia received an unexpected letter bearing the Pembroke crest. Her father's eldest sister, Lady Agatha Pembroke, had been a near mythical figure in Lydia's childhood, the scandalous aunt who had refused marriage in her youth, choosing instead to manage her own investments and live independently in Edinburgh. Family gatherings had always conspicuously excluded her, as if her mere presence might contaminate impressionable young ladies with dangerous ideas about feminine independence. "My dear Lydia," the letter began in bold, confident script. "Though we have not corresponded in years, a failure I regret, word of your marriage has reached even this northern outpost. I write not to offer belated congratulations, but to extend an invitation. Should you find yourself in need of respite from London, my home in Edinburgh stands ready to receive you. Sometimes, my dear girl, we require distance to gain perspective. Your affectionate aunt, Agatha." Lydia read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meanings. How had Aunt Agatha known she might need refuge? The subtle phrasing, respite, distance, perspective suggested an understanding that went beyond mere family courtesy. That evening, she presented the invitation to Garrett over dinner. They rarely dined alone. He preferred political gatherings where Lydia could be displayed like an ornamental centerpiece. But tonight, some parliamentary crisis had cancelled his engagement. "Your aunt wishes me to visit," Lydia said carefully. "Lady Agatha Pembroke in Edinburgh. I haven't seen her since childhood." Garrett barely glanced up from his newspaper. "The spinster aunt? The one your family doesn't discuss in polite company? She's independently wealthy and well-respected in Edinburgh society. She's a curiosity, a woman who refused her natural role and now lives in provincial isolation." He turned a page dismissively. "Why would you wish to visit such a person? She's family, and—" Lydia chose her words carefully. "It might benefit your political standing if I were seen maintaining cordial relations with all branches of my family, including those with Scottish connections. Scotland's MPs might view it favourably." This caught his attention. Garrett's political ambitions extended beyond England. He'd recently discussed the importance of cultivating Scottish support for a bill he was sponsoring. "How long would you be gone? Perhaps a month? 6 weeks at most?" He studied her with calculating eyes. "You're not fleeing London society, are you? No scandal I should know about?" "None whatsoever. I simply thought the change might be refreshing, and I could return with insights into Scottish political sentiment, if you wished." She hated manipulating him with his own ambitions, but it was the only leverage she possessed. "Very well. A month. But you'll write weekly, and you'll return immediately if I require your presence at any political function." "Of course." 2 weeks later, Lydia boarded the night train to Edinburgh, her lady's maid Mary accompanying her. As the locomotive pulled away from King's Cross Station, she felt the first loosening of the invisible chains that had bound her since her wedding day. Scotland revealed itself through the carriage window, rolling hills giving way to dramatic highlands, grey stone replacing London's red brick, a landscape that felt ancient and untamed compared to the manicured English countryside. Edinburgh itself took her breath away when they arrived at dawn. A city built on volcanic rock, its medieval old town climbing toward the castle that dominated the skyline, the elegant Georgian new town spreading below. Lady Agatha's residence occupied a stately townhouse on Charlotte Square, its clean neoclassical lines speaking to both wealth and taste. When Lydia was shown into the drawing room, she found her aunt precisely as she remembered, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a deep plum gown that defied conventional mourning colours, her blue eyes sharp with intelligence. "Lydia!" Agatha crossed the room with surprising energy for a woman past 60. "My God, you look like your grandmother did at your age. Beautiful, composed and absolutely miserable. Come, embrace me, and then we shall have tea and truth." The directness was shocking after months of London's suffocating propriety. Lydia found herself blinking back unexpected tears as her aunt's arms encircled her. "There now," Agatha murmured. "You're safe here. Whatever burden you're carrying, you needn't bear it alone." Over tea in Agatha's private sitting room, a warm, book-lined space that felt more like a sanctuary than any room in Garrett's pristine townhouse, Lydia found herself speaking truths she'd barely acknowledged to herself. "He married me for my name, and then sought to erase everything else I am," she said quietly, staring into her teacup. "I thought I understood the bargain. I thought I could maintain some part of myself within the marriage, but the contract—" She stopped, remembering the clause that forbade disclosure even to family. "I know about the contract," Agatha said gently. "Your mother wrote to me. She's devastated by what your father forced you to accept. Then you understand why I feel as though I'm suffocating. I've spent years cultivating knowledge, understanding the political landscape, documenting corruption and injustice. And now I can speak none of it without destroying my family." Agatha set down her cup with deliberate precision. "What if I told you that knowledge need not be spoken to have power? That there are other ways to effect change?" "What do you mean?" "Edinburgh isn't London, Lydia. Here, women have begun organizing for reform, suffrage, property rights, access to education. We have salons where actual ideas are discussed, not merely gossip. We have women who write, who publish, who influence policy through channels beyond direct political participation. Agatha leaned forward, her expression intense. Your observations, your documentation, they needn't die in silence. They simply need different vessels. Over the following weeks, Aunt Agatha introduced Lydia to a world she'd never imagined existed. The Edinburgh Ladies' Educational Association met weekly in a grand Georgian assembly room where women of all ages discussed everything from philosophy to political economy. The Scottish Women's Suffrage Society gathered in drawing rooms like Agatha's, planning campaigns and drafting petitions. More significantly, Agatha introduced her to journalists, reformers and intellectuals who moved in circles where ideas mattered more than titles. Among them was a gentleman who would alter Lydia's understanding of what her future might hold. Dr. Graham Thornhill, the same man who had spoken kindly to her on the balcony during her engagement ball, had relocated to Edinburgh to establish a public health clinic in the old town's impoverished neighbourhoods. When Lydia encountered him at one of Agatha's salon evenings, his surprise mirrored her own. "Lady Lydia, or Mrs. Blackwood, I should say. I had no idea you were in Edinburgh, visiting my aunt. And you? I thought you were in London working on parliamentary health legislation with Lord Pemberton." That particular collaboration ended poorly when I insisted on including provisions he found inconvenient to his financial interests. Graham's expression darkened briefly. "I discovered I preferred practical medicine to political maneuvering. Edinburgh has offered me the opportunity to practice medicine that actually helps people, rather than serving the interests of wealthy investors in hospital schemes." Throughout the evening, Lydia found herself drawn into conversation with Graham. Unlike the men in Garrett's circle, who either patronized her or ignored her entirely, Graham engaged with her ideas as though they had value. When she mentioned her interest in urban poverty's political roots, he didn't change the subject. He elaborated, sharing observations from his clinic that illuminated the human cost of the parliamentary corruption she had documented. "You see it too," he said quietly, as they stood by the window overlooking Charlotte Square's garden. "The connections between policy and suffering. Most people in your social sphere prefer not to notice. I've noticed for years, but I'm no longer permitted to speak of it. Your marriage contract." It wasn't a question. Agatha mentioned it, though not the details. A silencing clause. Lydia nodded, surprised by the relief she felt at his understanding. "Any political disclosure I make can be used to destroy my family financially. My husband ensures I remember that regularly." "What a waste." Graham's voice carried genuine anger. "To have your intelligence and silence it through legal intimidation. It's barbaric." "It's marriage," Lydia replied with bitter humor. "At least marriage as practiced by ambitious men who view their wives as decorative assets." "Not all marriages," Graham said softly. "My parents were partners in every sense. Intellectual equals who made decisions together, who valued each other's minds as much as their affections. It's possible, though perhaps rare." The wistfulness in his voice suggested personal loss. "Were?" Lydia asked gently. "They died of fever when I was at university. But they taught me what marriage could be at its best, what it should be." He turned to face her directly. "You deserved that kind of partnership, Lady Lydia. You still do." The comment, so simply stated, nearly undid her carefully maintained composure. No one, not even her mother, had suggested that she deserved more than the cold arrangement she'd been forced into. As the weeks passed, Lydia found herself increasingly part of Edinburgh's reformist circles. Agatha encouraged her to attend lectures at the university, where visiting professors discussed social reform and women's education. She accompanied Graham to his clinic, where she witnessed firsthand the poverty she'd only read about in London newspapers. She met writers and journalists who published under pseudonyms, women whose words shaped public opinion, even though their names remained hidden. One evening, as she and Agatha shared supper alone, her aunt posed a careful question. "You've been here nearly a month, Lydia. Garrett has written demanding your return for some political reception. You could go back, resume your performance as the silent political wife. Or," Agatha paused meaningfully, "you could consider alternatives." "What alternatives?" "I'm legally bound. The contract prevents you from making political disclosures. It doesn't prevent you from living separately should you choose. Many marriages of your class operate as polite fictions, husbands and wives maintaining separate residences, appearing together for necessary social functions, but otherwise living independent lives." Lydia's heart raced at the possibility. Garrett would never agree. His political ambitions require the appearance of domestic harmony. Then provide the appearance when necessary, but claim your independence otherwise. You have no children binding you to daily proximity. You could establish residence here or in another city, returning to London only for essential engagements. Agatha reached across the table to clasp Lydia's hand. "You could have a life, my dear. Perhaps not the one you imagined, but one with purpose and autonomy." That night, Lydia stood at her window, overlooking Edinburgh's illuminated streets, and allowed herself to imagine it, a life where she spent most of her time in this city of ideas and reform, where she could contribute to meaningful work, even if she couldn't speak her political knowledge directly, where she might build friendships based on intellectual respect rather than social calculation. And if she were honest with herself, a life where she might occasionally encounter Dr. Graham Thornhill, whose respectful intelligence and genuine kindness had awakened feelings she'd thought her marriage had killed forever. The possibility felt like light breaking through storm clouds. Not freedom, perhaps, but something closer to it than she'd known in months. She would return to London, as Garrett demanded, but she would return with new understanding. Her cage had a door, and though she couldn't break the lock entirely, she might occasionally slip through it to breathe freer air. Lydia's return to London came with a strategic proposal that surprised even herself with its boldness. She presented it to Garrett over breakfast in their Belgravia townhouse 3 days after her arrival from Edinburgh. "I propose we establish a salon," she began, pouring tea with the graceful precision expected of a political wife. "Monthly gatherings here, inviting MPs, journalists, intellectuals, a forum for discussing policy in a less formal setting than parliamentary chambers." Garrett looked up from his newspaper, his expression skeptical. "A salon? You mean one of those French-style intellectual gatherings?" "Precisely. They're becoming fashionable again among the political class. Lady Rothermere hosts one in Mayfair. Lord Salisbury's daughter runs a similar gathering. It would provide you access to influential figures in a setting where you control the environment, and it would demonstrate my support for your ambitions." She could see him calculating the advantages. He'd been frustrated lately by his limited access to senior parliamentarians, his relative newcomer status, keeping him at the periphery of important decisions. A well-curated salon could accelerate his political ascent. You would organize and host these gatherings, with your guidance regarding whom to invite, naturally. I would ensure conversation flowed productively, that your interests were subtly advanced. She paused, then added the hook she'd carefully prepared. "My time in Edinburgh gave me perspective on Scottish political sentiment. Several MPs I met expressed interest in your railway expansion bill. A salon would provide informal opportunities to build support." "You discussed my bill in Edinburgh?" His tone sharpened with suspicion. "Only in the most general terms, and only when directly asked by those already aware of it through parliamentary channels. I was careful, Garrett, but I learned that informal conversation often achieves what formal debate cannot." After several more minutes of discussion, Garrett agreed. Within a fortnight, invitations were dispatched for the first Blackwood Salon, to be held on a Friday evening in early March. Lydia orchestrated every detail, the guest list carefully balanced between Garrett's allies, potential supporters, and influential figures he hoped to court. the refreshments elegant but not ostentatious. The drawing room arranged to encourage conversation in intimate clusters while maintaining sightlines across the space. The evening of the first salon, Lydia dressed in a gown of deep sapphire silk that complemented the emerald she'd worn at her wedding. Mary arranged her hair in a sophisticated style that suggested intelligence rather than mere decoration. When Lydia studied her reflection, she saw not the crushed bride of 3 months ago, but a woman who had learned to wield the limited weapons available to her. The guests arrived promptly at 8, 30 carefully selected individuals representing various parliamentary factions, several journalists from respectable publications, 2 university professors Agatha had recommended, and a handful of influential wives whose support could prove valuable. Among the attendees, to Lydia's surprise and complex pleasure, was Dr. Graham Thornhill, invited at the suggestion of one of the MPs interested in public health reform. "Mrs. Blackwood," Graham greeted her with a respectful bow, his eyes conveying warmth that his formal tone concealed. "Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be included. Dr. Thornhill, I'm pleased you could attend. Your work in Edinburgh has gained considerable attention even here in London." She kept her voice professionally courteous, aware of Garrett watching from across the room. "I believe Lord Hampton wishes to discuss your clinic model. He's considering similar initiatives in Manchester." As the evening progressed, Lydia moved through the gathering with practiced grace, facilitating introductions, guiding conversations toward productive topics, ensuring Garrett remained the center of attention while appearing to effortlessly orchestrate the entire event. It was a performance, certainly, but one that gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her wedding. She observed Lord Pemberton attempting to corner Graham, undoubtedly probing whether the doctor still possessed information about the railway bribery scheme. She watched Lady Charlotte Whitmore, also in attendance, her father having attached himself to Garrett's political faction, attempting to charm an influential journalist. She noticed tensions between MPs supposedly allied, subtle disagreements that suggested fractures in parliamentary coalitions. And she documented none of it, spoke of it to no one, remembered everything. "Your wife is a remarkable hostess," Lord Hampton commented to Garrett near evening's end. "This gathering has been more productive than most parliamentary sessions. You're a fortunate man." "Indeed I am," Garrett replied, though his eyes on Lydia held assessment rather than affection. "She has proven useful." The word stung, but Lydia maintained her gracious smile. Useful. It was perhaps the highest compliment Garrett could offer, acknowledgement that she served his interests effectively. As guests departed, Graham approached to offer his farewell. "An impressive evening, Mrs. Blackwood. You've created something valuable here, a space for genuine dialogue across political divisions. That was the intention, though I suspect the dialogue will only be as genuine as the participants' ambitions allow." Cynical words from someone who's just demonstrated considerable diplomatic skill. Pragmatic words from someone who understands the limitations of good intentions. She glanced toward Garrett, who was deep in conversation with several MPs. "We work within the constraints available to us, Dr. Thornhill. Some constraints can be loosened, given time and strategy." His voice dropped lower. "I return to Edinburgh next week, but I'll be back in London monthly for medical consultations at Guy's Hospital. Perhaps future salons might find use for a physician's perspective on public health legislation." "I'm certain they would. You'll be welcome whenever you're in the city." The exchange, brief and superficial to any observer, felt weighted with unspoken meaning. They were both trapped individuals, finding small freedoms within their cages, his created by principle and limited resources, hers by marriage and legal contract. The Blackwood salons became a monthly fixture of London's political scene. By the third gathering, attendance had grown to 50, with MPs competing for invitations. Garrett's political star rose accordingly. He was appointed to 2 important parliamentary committees and began drafting legislation that senior party members actually read. And Lydia found her role expanding beyond mere hostess. MPs began seeking her out before events, asking her assessment of which colleagues might support specific measures, whether certain journalists were sympathetic to particular causes. She never directly disclosed sensitive information. The contract prevented that, but she became adept at asking questions that guided inquiries, suggesting connections without explicitly stating them, facilitating conversations that allowed others to reach conclusions she couldn't voice herself. It was a peculiar kind of power, influence without authority, impact without credit. But it was more than she'd possessed as Garrett's silent ornament. Graham attended whenever his schedule permitted. Their conversations remained professionally appropriate, yet Lydia found herself anticipating his presence at each gathering. He treated her as an intellectual equal, discussed complex policy matters without condescension, valued her observations even when she couched them in careful neutrality. In his company, she remembered who she'd been before marriage attempted to erase her. The observant, intelligent woman who'd believed her mind had value. The inevitable confrontation came at the salon in late May, when the guest list included both Lord Pemberton and several MPs. Graham had openly criticised in medical journals for blocking public health reforms. Lydia hadn't realised the depth of their antagonism until Pemberton cornered Graham near the refreshment table. "Dr. Thornhill," Pemberton's voice carried calculated malice, "still crusading for your paupers' clinics, I see. Tell me, does it not trouble you to waste medical training on those who contribute nothing to society?" "I consider healing the sick a contribution to society, Lord Pemberton. Perhaps a greater one than enriching oneself through manipulated railway contracts." Graham's response, while superficially polite, carried unmistakable accusation. The nearby conversations faltered. Lydia, standing across the room, felt her heart stop. Graham knew about the bribery scheme. She must have mentioned too much during their Edinburgh conversations, or perhaps he'd investigated independently. And now he was publicly alluding to it, risking the very exposure that her contract forbade. Pemberton's face flushed dangerously. "Careful, Doctor. Unfounded accusations have consequences, as do founded ones eventually." Graham held his ground despite Pemberton's superior social position. Truth has a way of emerging, despite efforts to suppress it. Garrett materialized at Lydia's elbow, his grip on her arm painful. "Your guest is causing a scene," he hissed. "Control him, or I'll have him removed." But before Lydia could intervene, Lord Hampton stepped between Graham and Pemberton with diplomatic smoothness. "Gentlemen, surely we can discuss policy disagreements without descending to personal accusations." "Dr. Thornhill, I believe Lady Carmichael wished to ask about your Edinburgh clinic model. Lord Pemberton, might I interest you in the discussion about Scottish railway expansion happening in the library?" The moment diffused, the gathering's rhythm gradually restored, but Garrett's fury didn't abate. "Your Edinburgh doctor friend has overstayed his welcome," he informed Lydia once most guests had departed. "He'll not receive future invitations. He's respected in medical reform circles. Excluding him sends a negative message about your commitment to health legislation. I don't care. He nearly caused a scandal in my own home, making wild accusations against a sitting MP. I won't have it." "The accusations aren't wild, though, are they?" The words escaped before Lydia could stop them. "Pemberton's corruption is an open secret among—" Garrett's hand struck the table with explosive force. "Enough! You will not speak of such things. The contract—" "I know what the bloody contract says." Lydia's composure finally shattered. "I know I'm forbidden from speaking truth, from using my knowledge, from being anything more than your decorative puppet. But don't you dare pretend Pemberton is innocent when we both know—" "Not another word." Garrett's voice dropped to deadly quiet. "You've forgotten yourself, Lydia. Perhaps spending time in Edinburgh with your eccentric aunt and her radical friends has confused you about your position. Let me clarify. You are my wife. You exist to support my interests. If you cannot even manage a simple gathering without allowing accusations against my political allies, then perhaps these salons have outlived their usefulness." Your allies are corrupt. They are useful, and in politics that matters more than moral purity. He stepped closer, his expression cold. I've tolerated your little intellectual pretensions because they served my purposes, but never mistake tolerance for permission to undermine me. The contract stands. Your family's security depends on your silence. Or have you forgotten your mother and sister so quickly? The threat, as always, was perfectly calibrated. Lydia felt her brief rebellion collapse under the weight of responsibility and fear. I haven't forgotten. Good. Then we understand each other. The salons continue, but without Dr. Thornhill's presence. You will write to him explaining that his services are no longer required. And you will remember, my dear wife, exactly what your cleverness costs if misapplied. That night, alone in her chamber, Lydia drafted the required letter to Graham. Her hand trembled as she wrote the formal phrases explaining that, due to evolving focus of the salon gatherings, we regret that future events will not include medical reform topics. The cowardice of the phrasing sickened her, but the alternative, allowing Graham continued access that might provoke another confrontation, seemed more dangerous still. She had glimpsed possibility in Edinburgh and in these few months of running the salons. She had remembered what it felt like to use her mind, to have purpose beyond mere decoration. And now that glimpse was being systematically curtailed by a man who valued her only for the social capital she provided. But as she sealed the letter, a thought crystallized. Garrett could control her actions, but not entirely her choices. He could forbid Graham from the salons, but not from London itself. He could threaten her family, but that threat only worked if she valued their safety more than her own pride. And she did. But perhaps there were ways to navigate even that. The cage remained, but she was beginning to understand its dimensions, to identify the spaces between the bars where movement remained possible. It wasn't freedom, but it was more than absolute captivity, and sometimes that had to be enough. Summer arrived with oppressive heat that turned London into a stifling mass of humanity and coal smoke. Parliament recessed in July, and fashionable society decamped to country estates or seaside resorts. Garrett announced they would spend August at his family's property in Sussex, a sprawling manor house that represented the Blackwood family's arrival into the landed gentry, purchased 3 generations ago with shipping fortune and maintained as proof of social legitimacy. Lydia dreaded the prospect of weeks in close quarters with Garrett and his parents, away from the limited freedoms her London social obligations provided. But she maintained her dutiful facade, supervising the packing of trunks and preparing herself for another performance of marital contentment. The night before their departure, a letter arrived bearing Edinburgh's postmark. Lydia recognized Aunt Agatha's distinctive script immediately and took it to her private sitting room before opening it. My dearest Lydia, Graham Thornhill has informed me of recent events at your salon and of your subsequent letter barring his attendance. I write not to criticize your difficult position, but to relay a message he asked me to convey, knowing direct correspondence between you would be unwise given your circumstances. He wishes you to know that he bears no ill will for the exclusion, understanding the pressures you face. He has been offered a permanent position at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, a prestigious appointment that would establish his career definitively. However, he has delayed accepting, ostensibly to complete his London consultancy obligations through the autumn. My dear, I am an old woman who has observed human nature for many decades. Graham Thornhill is remaining in England because he hopes circumstances may change in ways that allow your acquaintance to continue. I do not presume to know your heart, but I know a good man when I encounter one, and Graham is among the finest I've met. He sees you, Lydia, not the decorative wife your husband requires, but the intelligent, perceptive woman you actually are. I also write to extend another invitation. Should you wish to escape Sussex, whether for a week or longer, my home remains your refuge. Sometimes the most strategic move in a confined game is to temporarily leave the board entirely. Your affectionate aunt, Agatha Lydia, read the letter 3 times, her heart performing complicated maneuvers at the knowledge that Graham had delayed a career-defining opportunity on the possibility of what? That her marriage might somehow dissolve? That she might find a way to carve out space for a connection her husband had explicitly forbidden. It was madness, impractical, potentially disastrous, and yet the knowledge that someone valued her enough to wait, to hope, to see her as more than a political asset, it was a lifeline she desperately needed. Sussex proved as suffocating as she'd feared. The Blackwood Manor, called Thornfield Park, in a transparently aspirational nod to older families' naming conventions, sprawled across manicured grounds with the slightly ostentatious grandeur of new money attempting to mimic old. Garrett's mother, Lady Blackwood, filled the days with tedious social calls to neighbouring estates, each visit a performance designed to reinforce the family's social position. Garrett himself spent most of his time in his study, drafting the railway expansion bill that would be introduced in the autumn session. He required Lydia's presence at dinner and during social obligations, but otherwise ignored her with the casual disregard one might show an adequately functional piece of furniture. It was during the 3rd week, when Lydia walked the estate gardens to escape the house's oppressive atmosphere, that an unexpected visitor was announced. Lord Hampton, the MP who had diffused the confrontation between Graham and Pemberton at the Salon, had come to Sussex to discuss railway legislation with Garrett. Mrs. Blackwood, Hampton greeted her when she returned to the house. "How pleasant to find you here. I hoped we might speak privately before my meeting with your husband." They withdrew to the library, where Hampton closed the door with deliberate care before speaking again. "I'll be direct, as my time is limited. I've been investigating Lord Pemberton's railway dealings at the request of several concerned colleagues. Your salon gathering, where Dr. Thornhill made his pointed comments, catalyzed questions that needed asking. I believe Pemberton has indeed accepted bribes to influence contract awards." Lydia's breath caught. This was exactly the kind of conversation her contract forbade, political disclosure that could be construed as undermining Garrett's allies. "I cannot discuss such matters, Lord Hampton. My position—" "I'm not asking you to disclose anything. I'm informing you that investigation is proceeding and that when evidence emerges, as I believe it will, there will be parliamentary inquiry. Such inquiry may touch others in Pemberton's circle." He paused meaningfully. "Including your husband, if he continues his close association with Pemberton's faction." The implication was clear. Garrett was in danger of being swept up in scandal by proximity to Pemberton's corruption. "Does my husband know you're telling me this?" "No. But I've observed you, Mrs. Blackwood. You're far more perceptive than you pretend to be, and I suspect you've known about Pemberton's corruption longer than anyone. You've also been constrained from speaking. I don't know the specifics, but I recognize the signs of a woman who chooses her words with legal precision." Hampton's expression was surprisingly sympathetic. "I'm telling you this because you deserve warning. If Garrett doesn't distance himself from Pemberton before the scandal breaks, his political career will be destroyed, and your family's security, which I gather depends on his success, will be threatened." After Hampton's meeting with Garrett and his subsequent departure, Lydia sat alone in the library, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. If Pemberton's corruption was exposed, if parliamentary inquiry began, if Garrett was implicated even tangentially, the financial stability that had been purchased with her silence would evaporate. The marriage would remain legally binding, but worthless in practical terms. Her family would face ruin anyway, unless she acted. That evening she approached Garrett in his study, where he was reviewing Hampton's notes on the railway bill. "Hampton seemed unusually interested in your association with Lord Pemberton," she began carefully. "Politics makes strange bedfellows. Pemberton has influence I require. And if that influence becomes toxic, if his business dealings came under scrutiny—" Garrett's eyes sharpened. What do you know? Only that Hampton asked pointed questions, and that men don't ask questions unless they have suspicions worth investigating. She chose her next words with extreme care. I'm not making political disclosures. I'm suggesting strategic caution. If Pemberton faces scandal, your proximity to him becomes liability rather than asset. You overstep, Lydia. I'm trying to protect your career, which protects my family's security. Isn't that my prescribed role? Supporting your political ambitions? He studied her for a long moment, calculation visible in his expression. You've heard something. What? Nothing I can speak of without violating the contract you imposed, but perhaps you might make independent inquiries about Pemberton's railway investments. Perhaps you might discover reasons to create strategic distance before closer association becomes problematic. It was the most she could say without explicit disclosure. Whether Garrett would act on the carefully worded warning, she couldn't control. 3 days later, Garrett announced they were returning to London early. Business required his immediate attention. Lydia suspected Hampton's visit had prompted more investigation than Garrett admitted. She also suspected her warning had been calculated for maximum impact without violating the letter of her silencing clause. London in late August was nearly deserted. Fashionable society still scattered to country and coast, but the city's emptiness provided Lydia unexpected freedom. Garrett spent entire days at his club and parliamentary offices, pursuing whatever investigations Hampton had triggered. He barely noticed when Lydia mentioned she might visit her mother at Ashford House or call on old friends. She did visit her mother and found Lady Catherine frailer than expected, the strain of the past year's financial crisis having taken physical toll. But she also, with careful planning and deliberate courage, sent a note to Dr. Graham Thornhill at his London lodgings near Guy's Hospital. They met at the British Museum, a public but suitably intellectual venue where two acquaintances might coincidentally encounter each other while viewing the Elgin marbles. Graham arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his expression a complex mixture of pleasure and concern as he spotted Lydia among the ancient sculptures. Mrs. Blackwood, what a surprising coincidence. Dr. Thornhill. She kept her voice appropriately formal despite the rapid beating of her heart. I hoped I might find you here. I wanted to apologize for my letter excluding you from the salons. The decision was not entirely mine to make. I understood that. They began walking slowly through the gallery, maintaining the proper distance of casual acquaintances. Your aunt conveyed certain context. She wrote to me as well, about your Edinburgh position. Lydia paused before a marble frieze, using the pretense of studying it to gather courage. You should accept it, Dr. Thornhill. You shouldn't delay your career on the basis of circumstances unlikely to change. You refer to your marriage. I refer to legal and financial constraints that are absolute and unchangeable. I'm bound, Graham, not just by vows, but by a contract that ensures my family's destruction if I step beyond prescribed limits. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the intimacy of it hung between them. And meeting me here, does this exceed those limits? It exists in the margins. I'm doing nothing illegal, nothing that violates the contract's explicit terms. But I'm taking a risk that would have been unthinkable months ago. She turned to face him directly. Propriety be damned. I wanted you to know that your regard for me, your willingness to see me as more than my husband's decorative property, it has meant more than you can possibly understand. It reminded me that I'm still myself beneath the performance I'm required to give. Lydia, he said her name softly, with a reverence that made her chest ache. If circumstances were different, but they're not, and wishing doesn't change reality. She forced herself to speak the truth, however painful. You should go to Edinburgh. Build your clinic, advance your career, find someone whose life isn't encased in legal contracts and financial threats. You deserve that happiness. And you? What do you deserve? Apparently exactly what I have. A loveless marriage to a man who values me only as political asset, silence about everything I know, a cage made of emeralds and legal documents. The bitterness she'd suppressed for months flooded her voice. But within that cage, I'm learning to move. The salons, limited as they are, give me purpose. Agatha's offer of refuge provides escape when London becomes unbearable. It's not what I imagined my life would be, but it's more than I had 6 months ago. That's an extraordinarily low standard for an extraordinarily remarkable woman. They walked in silence for several minutes. Two people surrounded by ancient art, wrestling with decidedly modern problems. Finally, Graham spoke again. I'll accept the Edinburgh position as you advise, but I'll return to London regularly. Monthly consultancies at Guy's provide legitimate excuse. And if circumstances ever change, if the constraints binding you ever loosen, I want you to know that my regard, as you term it, will remain constant. He paused, then added quietly, I'll wait, Lydia. Perhaps foolishly, but I'll wait. Before she could respond, before she could tell him not to waste his life waiting for possibilities that would never materialize, a familiar voice cut through the gallery. Mrs. Blackwood? How unexpected to find you here. Lydia's blood froze. Lady Charlotte Whitmore stood several paces away, her expression a mixture of surprise and calculating malice. Her companion, some gentleman Lydia didn't recognize, looking on with polite curiosity. Lady Charlotte! Indeed, what a coincidence. I was just admiring the marbles. And making conversation with Dr. Thornhill, I see. I thought he'd been excluded from your salon gatherings after that unfortunate scene with Lord Pemberton. Charlotte's tone dripped false sweetness. Yet here you are, meeting privately in a museum. How very intellectual. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Charlotte would absolutely report this encounter to Garrett, framing it as secretly as possible. Graham stepped forward with remarkable composure. Lady Charlotte, actually Mrs. Blackwood and I encountered each other entirely by chance. I was consulting a colleague at the British Museum's Medical Historical Collection. They have remarkable surgical instruments from antiquity, and happened upon Mrs. Blackwood while leaving. We exchanged brief pleasantries, nothing more. How very innocent, Charlotte replied, her skepticism obvious. Well, I won't keep you from your pleasantries. Do give my regards to your husband, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm certain he'll be interested to hear of your cultural pursuits. After Charlotte and her companion moved away, Lydia felt the walls of her cage slamming shut with renewed force. She'll tell Garrett. She'll frame this as an illicit meeting. Then tell him first. Control the narrative. You encountered me by pure chance while viewing the marbles, which is technically precisely what anyone observing would have seen. Garrett won't believe in coincidence. He'll suspect subterfuge, and he'll be right. Then perhaps it's time to stop caring quite so much what Garrett suspects. Graham's voice carried unexpected steel. You've spent months contorting yourself to accommodate his suspicions and demands. Maybe the answer isn't better deception, but refusing to live entirely on his terms. The radical nature of the suggestion that she might openly defy Garrett's constraints rather than carefully navigating around them was both terrifying and oddly liberating. That evening, when Garrett returned from his parliamentary office, Lydia preempted Charlotte's inevitable report. I encountered Dr. Thornhill at the British Museum today, entirely by chance, while I was viewing the Elgin marbles. We exchanged brief pleasantries. I mention it because Lady Charlotte Whitmore was also present and will undoubtedly report the coincidence to you with whatever implications she finds most entertaining. Garrett's expression darkened. You were explicitly forbidden from associating with Thornhill. I was forbidden from inviting him to the salons. I cannot control whom I encounter in public spaces, nor would it be appropriate to cut someone dead in a museum gallery. That would create exactly the kind of social awkwardness that reflects poorly on you. It was a carefully constructed defense, and they both knew it walked the finest of lines between truth and defiance. You're becoming dangerously bold, Lydia. I'm becoming strategically competent. There's a difference. You wanted a wife who could navigate society in support of your political ambitions. That requires autonomous judgment, not just puppetry. She held his gaze steadily. I've warned you about Pemberton. I've maintained the salons that advance your career. I've been exactly what you required. An accidental encounter in a museum, handled with appropriate discretion, is hardly betrayal. The argument hung between them, a test of whether Garrett's need for her social competence outweighed his desire for absolute control. Finally, with visible reluctance, he relented. Fine, but there will be no further accidents. Is that understood? Perfectly. That night, Lydia stood at her bedroom window overlooking Belgravia's gaslit streets and acknowledged a truth she'd been avoiding. Her marriage would never transform into partnership. Garrett would never see her as an equal. The contract would always bind her. But within those constraints, she was learning to carve out territories of autonomous action, small rebellions that preserved her sense of self. And Graham Thornhill would be in Edinburgh, building his career, but occasionally returning to London. They might encounter each other at medical lectures or museum galleries or other intellectually respectable venues. They would maintain proper distance, appropriate formality, but they would both know that someone in the world saw her true self, valued her actual mind, and perhaps most remarkably, was willing to wait for a future that might never arrive. It wasn't the romantic partnership she'd once dreamed of, but in her current reality, it was a form of hope. And hope, Lydia was discovering, could survive even in gilded cages. Autumn descended on London with characteristic drama, fog rolling up from the Thames, rain lashing the cobblestones, the city transforming into a study in grey and shadow. Parliament reconvened, and with it came the scandal Lydia had anticipated since Lord Hampton's warning in Sussex. The Times published the exposé on a Tuesday morning in late September. Lord Pemberton's railway bribery scheme, meticulously documented across 3 full pages, included names, dates, contract details, and financial evidence that demolished any possibility of denial. The article named several MPs in Pemberton's immediate circle as persons of interest, warranting parliamentary investigation. Garrett Blackwood was not among those named, but 2 of his close political associates were. Lydia read the article over breakfast, while Garrett sat across from her in stunned silence. She felt no satisfaction, only grim acknowledgement that the corruption she'd observed for years was finally facing public reckoning. "Hampton warned you," she said quietly. "I warned you. You had months to distance yourself from Pemberton's circle. I didn't believe the evidence would be this comprehensive, or that they'd actually publish." Garrett's face had gone pale. "My railway bill, it's politically toxic now, associated with Pemberton's scheme, even though there's no actual connection. You made it politically toxic by maintaining close alliance with known corrupt actors." Lydia set down the newspaper. "What will you do?" "Damage control. Issue a statement condemning Pemberton, emphasize my ignorance of his dealings, distance myself from the implicated MPs. His eyes met hers with unexpected calculation. "I'll need your help. The autumn salon. It happens in 3 days. We'll use it to rehabilitate my reputation, demonstrate my commitment to reform and transparency." The irony of Garrett Blackwood positioning himself as a reformer when his entire marriage was built on legally enforced silence about corruption was not lost on Lydia, but she recognized opportunity when it presented itself. "I'll help," she agreed, "but on certain conditions. You're in no position to make demands." "Actually, I am. Your political survival depends on social rehabilitation, which depends on me hosting a successful salon that convinces influential people you're on the side of integrity. I can do that convincingly, or I can do it perfunctorily. The difference will be evident." Garrett's jaw tightened. "What conditions?" "First, Graham Thornhill is invited and allowed to attend. His presence signals your commitment to genuine reform, and his public health credentials provide progressive cover. Second, I want freedom to spend 1 month per year in Edinburgh with Aunt Agatha. No questions asked, no interference. Third, the contract's enforcement becomes theoretical rather than practical. You maintain the legal right to invoke it, but you don't threaten me with it weekly. You're extorting me. I'm negotiating from rare temporary advantage. You can accept my terms and have a wife who actively supports your rehabilitation, or refuse and have a wife who does the bare minimum while your career implodes." Lydia's voice remained calm, but her heart raced. This was the most overt defiance she'd ever attempted. "Choose quickly. The scandal accelerates by the hour." After several tense minutes, Garrett nodded curtly. "Agreed. But if you embarrass me or undermine my recovery, the contract enforcement returns with full force." "Understood." The autumn salon became the most critical event of Lydia's social career. She spent 3 days orchestrating every detail with strategic precision. The guest list included reformist MPs, journalists who had covered the Pemberton scandal, several medical and academic figures whose presence would signal intellectual seriousness, and carefully selected society figures whose attendance would demonstrate continued elite support despite the political turbulence. Graham received his invitation via messenger. He replied within hours, confirming his attendance and, in a brief private note enclosed separately, expressing admiration for whatever maneuvering had prompted Garrett's reversal. The evening of the salon, Lydia dressed with particular care. Her gown was deep burgundy, rich but not ostentatious, conveying seriousness of purpose. She wore pearls rather than the Ashford emeralds, a subtle signal of restraint appropriate to the moment's gravity. Guests arrived to find the Belgravia townhouse arranged for substantive conversation rather than mere social display. The usual elaborate refreshments had been replaced with simpler fare. The drawing room's arrangement encouraged discussion of serious topics. Even the musical entertainment had been eliminated. This evening was about ideas, not entertainment. Garrett delivered opening remarks that positioned him as an unwitting victim of associates' corruption, emphasizing his commitment to transparency and reform. Lydia watched the audience's reactions carefully, noting skepticism among some attendees, tentative acceptance among others. The performance was adequate but not convincing. Garrett lacked the genuine passion that made Reformation narratives believable. Then Graham spoke. He hadn't been scheduled for remarks, but Lydia had quietly encouraged him to prepare something. When he requested the floor, Lydia graciously yielded. "I appreciate Mrs. Blackwood's invitation to speak briefly," Graham began, his voice carrying natural authority. "Recent revelations about corruption in parliamentary circles have shocked many, but for those of us working in public health, in the slums and tenements where policy failures translate directly into human suffering, this corruption has long been visible in its effects. The question now is whether we will continue systems that enable such corruption or whether we will demand genuine reform." He spoke for 10 minutes, outlining specific policy changes that would increase transparency in government contracting, improve oversight of MPs' financial interests, and create mechanisms for reporting corruption without fear of legal retaliation. His passion was evident, his expertise undeniable, and his presence at the Blackwood Salon implicitly endorsed Garrett's Reformation narrative. If someone as principled as Dr. Thornhill believed in Blackwood's potential for reform, perhaps others should as well. The shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Conversations after Graham's remarks took on serious, engaged character. MPs debated specific reforms. Journalists asked substantive questions. Even the skeptical attendees seemed willing to grant Garrett the benefit of doubt. As the evening concluded and guests departed, Lord Hampton approached Lydia privately. "Masterfully done, Mrs. Blackwood. Inviting Thornhill was strategically brilliant. His endorsement of your husband's reformation carries significant weight." "Graham endorsed reforms, not necessarily my husband," Lydia replied with careful honesty. "But I hope the association proves beneficial to all involved." "Indeed." Hampton studied her with penetrating intelligence. "You know, I've watched you for months now. You're the most politically astute person in your husband's circle, and you do it all while pretending to be merely decorative. It's a remarkable performance." "I'm just a hostess, Lord Hampton." "You're far more than that, and we both know it, but I understand why you must pretend otherwise." He glanced toward Garrett, who was accepting congratulations across the room. "I hope your husband eventually recognizes what an asset he truly has in you. And I hope he proves worthy of the loyalty you've shown him, despite considerable provocation." After the last guest departed, Garrett's relief was palpable. "You were right about Thornhill. His presence changed the entire dynamic. This might actually work. I might survive this scandal after all. Then my conditions stand?" "Yes, you've earned them." Garrett poured himself brandy, his first genuine smile in days appearing. 1 month in Edinburgh annually. Thornhill's occasional presence at salons, and I'll reserve contract enforcement for actual betrayals rather than imagined ones. It wasn't a declaration of love or respect, but it was a negotiated détente that gave Lydia more freedom than she'd possessed since her wedding day. Graham lingered after the other guests, ostensibly discussing medical reform details with Garrett, but clearly waiting for a moment with Lydia. When Garrett was called away by his butler regarding some household matter, Graham approached. "That was extraordinary strategy," he said quietly. "Using the scandal to negotiate for your own freedom." "Limited freedom," Lydia corrected. "But more than I had yesterday. I leave for Edinburgh next week. The Royal Infirmary position begins in October, but I'll return monthly as promised. For medical consultations. And for the occasional salon, apparently." His eyes held warmth that made her breath catch, and perhaps the occasional coincidental museum visit, properly chaperoned by ancient marble sculptures. That would be acceptable. They stood in silence for a moment, two people whose lives had become unexpectedly entangled by circumstance and mutual recognition. Finally, Graham spoke again. "You asked me once what you deserved. I've thought about that question considerably. You deserve a life of purpose and intellectual fulfillment, partnerships built on mutual respect, freedom to speak truth without fear of legal retaliation. You deserve, Lydia, to be seen and valued for exactly who you are. And if my circumstances prevent most of that, then you deserve to know that someone, somewhere, sees you anyway, knows your worth anyway, and believes that even gilded cages sometimes develop cracks that become doors." Before she could respond, Garrett's return ended their conversation. Graham departed with appropriate formality, leaving Lydia with a heart full of complicated emotions. The months that followed brought gradual transformation. The Pemberton scandal resulted in parliamentary reform legislation that Graham had outlined at the Salon. Increased financial transparency, stronger oversight mechanisms, whistleblower protections. Garrett, having successfully repositioned himself as a reform advocate, gained political capital rather than losing it. His railway bill passed in modified form, stripped of the provisions that would have most benefited Pemberton's associates. The Blackwood salons continued, now focused explicitly on reform topics. Lydia's reputation as a hostess of substantive intellectual gatherings grew. Journalists began attending regularly, quoting salon discussions in their articles. MPs used the gatherings to test policy ideas before introducing legislation, and Lydia discovered she could have impact even within constraints. She couldn't make direct political disclosures, but she could facilitate conversations that led others to correct conclusions. She couldn't publicly expose corruption, but she could ensure reformers and journalists encountered each other in settings conducive to sharing information. She couldn't speak freely, but she could create spaces where others spoke truth. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was a life with meaning. Her month in Edinburgh, finally claimed the following spring, restored her spirit in ways she hadn't anticipated. Aunt Agatha's world of intellectual women and reform movements reminded her that female intelligence wasn't abnormal or threatening. It was simply underutilized by societies too foolish to recognize its value. She attended university lectures, participated in suffrage society meetings, and spent long evenings in conversation with women who saw political participation not as unwomanly ambition, but as civic obligation. And Graham Thornhill became a steady presence in her life, professional, appropriate, but undeniably significant. They attended medical society lectures together, discussed public health legislation, debated reform strategies. Their friendship remained carefully within propriety's boundaries, but the mutual regard and intellectual partnership were undeniable. One evening, as they walked through Edinburgh's Princes Street Gardens, with Aunt Agatha serving as chaperone at a discreet distance, Graham voiced the question they'd both carefully avoided. Do you ever wish you could simply leave? Start fresh somewhere he couldn't touch you? Constantly. But the contract ensures that leaving means destroying my family. My mother, my sister, my brother, they would all suffer for my freedom. I can't purchase my own liberation with their ruin. Even if your marriage is loveless and constraining, even then, some cages can't be escaped, only endured. Lydia stopped walking, turning to face him directly. But you've made the endurance bearable, Graham. You've reminded me that I'm still myself beneath the performance. That matters more than you might understand. And if someday the cage opened, if circumstances changed, if the threats lost their power, if freedom became possible, then I would remember the man who saw me, valued me, and waited, even when waiting was foolish. She managed a smile. But we shouldn't build futures on hypotheticals. No, we should build them on choices, however limited. And you've chosen to survive with integrity intact, to make meaning within constraints, to remain yourself despite pressure, to become someone else's creation. That's not a small thing, Lydia. As the Edinburgh month concluded and she returned to London, to Garrett's political world, to her role as accomplished hostess, to the careful navigation of contract limitations, Lydia carried with her renewed understanding of her own worth. She wasn't just surviving the cage, she was transforming it into something that, while still constraining, at least allowed her to bloom. The Blackwood Salons became London's premier forum for serious political discussion. Lydia's reputation grew to the point where hostesses across the city attempted to imitate her model. Garrett's political career flourished, his association with reform rather than corruption, securing him committee appointments and ministerial consideration. And once per month, when Graham returned to London for his medical consultations, they would encounter each other at salons or lectures or museum galleries, two people whose lives had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control, who had found in each other recognition and respect, who maintained proper distance while acknowledging improper feelings, who had learned that sometimes the most profound partnerships are those that exist in the spaces between what society permits and what hearts require. Years later, when historians documented the parliamentary reforms that followed the Pemberton scandal, they would note the role of political salons in shaping reformist sentiment. They would praise men like Lord Hampden and Dr. Graham Thornhill for their principled advocacy. They would not mention Lydia Blackwood, née Ashford, whose intelligence had first identified the corruption, whose strategic silence had protected her family, whose careful facilitation had enabled reforms she could never openly champion. But Graham would remember, Agatha would remember, and Lydia herself would remember that she had survived with her essential self intact, had made meaning within constraints, had refused to let a contract define her entirely. The cage remained, but within it she had bloomed, and sometimes, not in fairy tales but in the complicated reality of constrained lives. That was its own kind of victory. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far it has traveled.